With the beginning of the new year, things look pretty grim for most American socialists. Bernie's movement is completely defeated, and meanwhile we witness the capitulation of other democratic socialists like AOC. And with that, even any semblance of a common left seems to be disappearing. The bluffs of America's prominent left-wing figureheads like Jacobin Magazine, Chomsky, the Young Turks, and Vosh are being called. And now it's pretty clear that these people have no idea what they're talking about or what they're even doing. So maybe it's time to go back to the basics and brush up on some things people might be taking for granted. For starters, on the meaning of words like socialism. What is socialism? You probably have some idea of what it means. In countries that don't have strong socialist traditions, you might refer to definitions like workers' ownership of the means of production. If you're more mature, you probably draw from the wealth of real and concrete movements, political phenomena, and states, both past and present. But when you live in countries like America, there aren't really any clear and easy examples you can draw from in your own immediate surroundings. Even if we're only talking about the West, socialism is pretty redundant. In continental Europe, it's nothing new, and even England has the Labour Party. The East and the Global South, meanwhile, speak for themselves. So Americans alone are confronted with the need to understand what socialism is from scratch, in a direct and individual way.
This can be related to the very religious and civilizational foundations of Anglo-America. Like the Puritans before them, Americans struggle with understanding the weight of tradition and laws that need to be unwritten. When the Pilgrims arrived on the continent, they arrived in a place where they didn't have any roots or history. The very foundations of civilization itself had to be built from scratch. And that's actually why American leftists like Vosh feel courageous enough to decide what is or isn't socialism, even at the expense of the real and living traditions that gave meaning to the word in the first place. He read an explicit definition written somewhere and thinks reality follows from whatever sentence that happens to be, rather than understanding that the sentence is only someone's best attempt to sum up reality. But socialism never began as someone's definition. It was actually a real phenomena first, and this phenomena would later come to be named socialism.
What's ironic about this uniquely American problem with socialism is that America has actually played a profound role in its history and development. The same civilizational foundation unique to America was also the basis for the emergence of its many artificial communities. In these communities, the way people worked, ate, slept, and even married was determined reflexively by precepts both religious and pragmatic. By this same token, it was inevitable that these societies were communal by nature. But this wasn't because the Pilgrims were communists. It's because when you reflexively establish a community from scratch, it's impossible to take social life, including the way you work, eat, clothe, and shelter yourself, for granted. European feudalism, for an example, couldn't just be imported to the New World. Nobody could arbitrarily decide to make themselves lord or king, because in spite of what Americans often think about these things today, kings and lords don't arise from arbitrary choices, but from objective contradictions developing through the course of history. Nobody just wakes up on the wrong side of the bed one day and decides that private property markets or social distinctions ought to exist. When you're creating such a community from scratch, and land you don't have any roots or history in, the material basis for these is going to be underdeveloped, especially when many of these communities were already commercial enterprises funded by remote investors. Nevertheless, these American communities often come to influence and even be influenced by the ideas of the European utopian thinkers, like Charles Fourier and Robert Owen.
Traditional European society wasn't only being broken down in the New World. What the alien and inhospitable environment of the New World was to the Pilgrims, the revolutions of Europe were for European society. England's Industrial Revolution and land enclosures destroyed the stable, familiar, and traditional way of living peasants had been accustomed to for centuries. Their landlessness gave rise to an unprecedented existential and economic insecurity. The French Revolution, meanwhile, overturned the codified hierarchies that had long allowed commoners to situate themselves in an ultimately meaningful and consistent social reality. Universal political rights were not able to fill the vacuum left behind by the loss of the Ancien Regime's concrete social bonds. These two revolutions were in fact distinct forms of what amounted to the same apocalypse, and this apocalypse we now call modernity. To quote one of the most famous passages from the Communist Manifesto, "All fixed, fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind." All of this would shine a spotlight onto something that would come to be called the social question, which had long been an object of contemplation for European humanist philosophers, but which only now acquired real-world relevance. Before the crisis of modernity, Thinking about social realities as people like Hobbes and Rousseau had done could be traced to the lineage of the humanist tradition, which attempted to inquire into the real premises of man, be they physiological, natural, environmental, or even societal and social. But the important thing is that before these things were thrust to the fore by modernity, these realities are ultimately unwritten and could be taken for granted. Every society always had a way of relating to the ineffable, sacred, and sublime thing that made the people within it part of a greater whole. So the fact that sociality had to be explicitly named and made reflexive implies a devastating loss of the ability to relate to it implicitly, as mankind had done for all its history.
Going back to the Utopians, people like Owen, Fourier, and Saint-Simon were the first thinkers to articulate the social question in practical terms. Eventually, this uniquely modern social crisis, and the fact that people were beginning to catch on to it, would become evident to everyone. To again quote the manifesto, it became evident to Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies. But this was still a sort of meme. In terms of real examples, let alone exact definitions, there wasn't really a clear picture of what socialism or communism actually was. What there was a common social crisis and an increasing awareness that this crisis could only be responded to in a likewise common social way. The Utopians responded to it by envisioning what a better society would look like and how it would run from scratch. So the fact that their ideas were largely implemented in America should come as a surprise to no one. As diverse and peculiar as utopian sites like Indiana's New Harmony, Ohio's Utopia, and New Jersey's Phalanx were, with some prior American communities, like those of the Shakers, even taking religion as their foundation, they were taken as examples by many in Europe of communism or socialism's actuality. And so by 1848, thinkers like Friedrich Engels would come to the view that America was the proving ground of communism.
This was not because Engels thought these societies conformed to some pre-existing definition of socialism. Very simple. It was because they were examples of the fact that economic relations, in short, the way people make a living, could be regarded as being relevant at a common social level. This sounds like a truism today. But you have to keep in mind that in the 19th century, even the very recognition of common social realities could not be taken for granted. When the feudal relations that allowed people to take their substantive social bonds for granted broke down, the cool brutality of all against all, dog eat dog, and every man for himself, dog eats death. The way the English rationalized this abject barbarism was by claiming that those who were not able to survive the punishing cruelties of the new laissez-faire society were used to fight to life in general, that much like animals, they were merely at the cruel mercy of nature itself. In the prior history of humanity, there had always been periodic catastrophes, but eventually they will pass, and life will go on and as had it before. But modernity was a catastrophe that kept repeating itself over and over again, with no real end in sight. Industrial capitalism was not something humans' lives could adapt to. The newly formed proletariat worked like animals, even living day to day in ways animals themselves will probably find intolerable. So the main point of socialist association with workers' ownership of the means of production was never because people just wanted to extend the liberal democratic notion of sovereignty to the workplace. This definition has only recently become popular because of the very contemporary crisis of liberalism, having already been surpassed by socialism with Chinese characteristics. The real point was what would be entailed by this ownership, what this ownership will mean, which is that production will no longer be incompatible with the majority of people's actual lives, that it will serve social ends rather than the private ends of individual capitalists. The real promise of socialism was not about people exercising arbitrary choices for the sake of control, but a more or less dignified human life. And if you think that's vague, it's because it is. This is a reason the third chapter of the Communist Manifesto described more than 6,000 types of socialist phenomena, some of which were called reactionary and bourgeois. They were all united by the simple recognition that modern society anarchy of production was untenable.
The main thing to take away here is that socialism should be understood as an objective historical phenomenon, rather than some subjective doctrine. It doesn't come from some arbitrary idea about how society should be. It's a way of relating to the fact that society became directly responsible for the sphere of production in the first place. In that sense, you could say that we are already living in some kind of socialism, and have been since around the 1930s. there's more truth to the often mocked popular view that countries today are mixed economies, or that we have socialism for the rich, and there is in the views of so-called Marxist pseudo-intellectuals who believe in fairy tales about pure socialism. But today's socialism didn't emerge from societies being built from scratch, like the experiments of the Utopians. In fact, one of the main shortcomings of the Utopians, according to Marx and Engels, was that they were inevitably restricted by the prejudices of their own social and institutional position in envisioning a new society. For Marx and Engels, the seed of a new society lay in the contradictions internal to the old one, rather than the heads of social reformers. Both understood that socialism was an inevitable consequence of economic transformations already underway. In socialism, utopian or scientific, Engels directly spells out that in the trust, freedom of competition changes into its very opposite, into monopoly, and the production without any definite plan of capitalistic society capitulates to the production upon a definite plan of the invading socialistic society. These were also transformations whose development was later elaborated by Lenin in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. For them, however, the revolutionary class struggle was a decisive site in which these transformations were being given meaning, both politically and culturally. We may already be living in a type of socialism, but it is still only within Marxism that a scientific understanding of it is possible. To say we already live in a type of socialism should, if anything, reveal to socialists just how rotten the current establishments of America and Europe really are. They conjure up phrases and pageantry about neoliberalism and the free market, trying to induce fear about the bogeyman of socialism, all the while corresponding to so barefaced an exploitation of the community by a small band of dividend mongers. This may sound crazy, or even shocking, but really think about it. Even the way we use words like socialism or capitalism assumes we're already living in the former. We treat the economic sphere not as some primordial wilderness, as the English did in the 19th century, but as a place where systems can be voluntarily implemented, replaced, or removed. This assumes a political relationship to the economy that's actually already effectively socialist in nature. Think about words like privatization, which reveals private property to be not a sovereign end in itself, as it was in 19th century liberalism, but an extension of the state's own policy-making decision. All the rhetoric about the free market and free enterprise is nothing but a swindle. So let's address the elephant in the room. Why do the same contradiction of 19th century industrial capitalism observed by Marx still persist?
Well, just because socialism already more or less prevailed doesn't mean that what Marx observed and was describing in Capital just disappeared. It rather transformed in new ways, pretty much rendering what most people take as socialism today to be redundant. What this means is that socialists need to rethink what the real site of today's social commons is. And there's no point in being caught up in these rigid categories in the first place, because capitalism itself was never some self-enclosed system. It's a question of understanding what the real essence of capitalism was in the first place, which is by no means self-evident. Pseudo-intellectual Marxist-sounding nerds talk about things like the value form, but this is nowhere near specific enough. What stands to question is rather this: what really is this apocalyptic event we call modernity? For starters, some things need to be borne in mind about the way people lived in the basis of civilizations before what we call the era of modern capitalism. We mentioned before that periodic crises and catastrophes had always occurred in the history of humanity, but the thing that defined the ability for civilizations to survive the test of time was the living being of the people that populated them. What's meant by this is their general way of life, which can not only generally support them, their family, their traditions and customs, but could also be passed along to the next generation. We're talking about something which risk analyst Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragile, ways of living that had already been exposed and are able to subtly respond to most of the difficulties life inevitably has in store. It's this substantial livelihood that defines the continuity of civilizations, without which no people would even survive for more than a single generation. And so what's entailed by this real being, this circle of human life, if you will, is some kind of original connection between people and their quite literal means of production. Marx titles the 26th chapter of his first volume of Capital The Secret of Primitive Accumulation. In it, he lays out how the capitalist system presupposes the complete separation of the laborers from all property in the means by which they can realize their labor. In this way, peasants who were once able to sell their labor through the commodities they themselves produced must be obliged to offer for sale as a commodity that very labor power, which exists only in his living self. So peasants, who once possessed some kind of living being, became sellers of themselves only after they had already been robbed of all of their own means of production, and of all the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And the history of this, their expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. Without analyzing the conditions that gave rise to it, the simplest way to understand what we call modern history lies in this fundamental separation between individuals and their living being, specifically in the form of their original means of production.
So that should really put socialism into a new perspective. Above all, it should be understood as this striving for some kind of return to this Dasein, as Heidegger called it, a striving which can actually be argued to be the main motor of class struggle across the history of humanity. It should come as no surprise that the American industrial proletariat eventually becomes a type of middle class, with green lawns and white picket fences. That this same industrial proletariat, whether in Western Europe or even in the Soviet Union and in China, eventually acquires some measure of a substantial livelihood, losing its amorphous and de-individualized qualities. These represent a return to the real and definite being characteristic of the peasantry. The striving towards this being never actually disappeared, but rather just assumed a new form in the industrial society. Despite this, socialism today has pressing relevance. It's clear that in the West, and in America in particular, this middle class has been disappearing. 19th century capitalism may be long gone, but the fundamental contradictions that gave meaning to Marx's original discovery have endured. It's clear that some type of new proletarianization is happening, and that the status quo is not able to make sense of it. Marxism has never been more relevant. So why do Marxists in America still fail to acquire any meaningful political relevance whatsoever?
For starters, it's because they're committing the same mistake that Western Marxists have always made, which is neglecting the objectivity of living being, confusing it for some leftover petty bourgeois or middle-class tendency, rather than the very substance of the proletarian class struggle. They undialectically assume that the destruction, negation posed by proletarianization puts an end to this striving toward a return to Dasein, when it's actually the striving that's really at stake in it, as the negation of the negation. After all, what was it that brought communists to power in countries like Russia, China, and in the Third World? Was it promising everything would be turned into one big Amazon warehouse? Actually, that's more or less what happened in the West, because in the countries where communists acquired power, the majority of the population were still peasants who merely were confronted by the inevitability of proletarianization. Communist parties didn't only promise that this proletarianization could be dictated on new and more humane terms, but effectively fought for the ability for peasants themselves to possess the necessary independence to participate in determining these terms in the first place. In sum, what all successful communist parties had in common was a program of land reform. Land reform, paradoxically, meant that the very increased socialization corresponding to the proletarianization was the very means by which peasants could preserve or even reacquire their lost sense of independent living being. This way, industrial modernity didn't have to entail the savagery and brutality of Anglo-Saxon capitalism. Peasants would become dependent on the centralized proletarian dictatorship, but this dependence also gave them a newfound sense of independent human dignity. That's exactly the reason people like Trotsky would call Stalin a vulgar democrat, or why ultra-leftists call Mao a peasant warlord. It's because instead of assimilating everyone into one universal Amazon warehouse, which was more or less Trotsky's actual plan, they allowed the peasant particularity to flourish in unprecedented ways. Preserving or returning to the conditions of life before industrial modernity wasn't possible, as reactionaries always tried to swindle peasants into thinking. But proletarianization doesn't mean that the more essential living being corresponding to it disappears forever. Rather, for Marxists, it represents its precise ability to persevere through the trials and tribulations industrial modernity has in store. That's why only the communists were able to revive the Russian and Chinese civilizations, which would have otherwise continued to be crushed under the boot of German, English, and later American imperialism. Without the reparcelization of landed property, which is the most fundamental means of production of all, communists would have never been able to gain the trust of the majority of their country's people. Without it, new forms of social ownership like the Soviet kolkhozes or Chinese people's communes, ones that emerged on the basis of a mutual interaction between the state and the people, would have never been able to be possible. But you don't just have to draw from the past to understand how decisive land reform is for revolutionary socialists.
Take today's South Africa, for example. Something a lot of people tend to forget is that South Africa's current ruling party, the African National Congress, or ANC, was not only a socialist organization in the past, but was even aligned with the socialist bloc during the Cold War. The promise of land reform had been a decisive and indispensable element of the then decades-long anti-apartheid struggle. There's a simple reason for that. Politicians and parties can make all the promises they want, but at the end of the day, land, or economic space, the most important means of production, is the only thing that makes promises a reality. For the black majority to be able to rule and live dignified lives in their own country, land is the simplest and most fundamental premise. It's the foundation of civilization itself. It's what allows people not to have to depend on politicians' promises, but be able to, in the first place, cultivate a sense of living being independent. And even speaking in terms of state or central initiatives, you can't do anything if you don't have land. Land is literal space, in the most abstract term that could be understood politically or economically. Well, everyone knows apartheid came to an end politically in 1994. It has since then persisted economically, and the lack of the implementation of any land reform is arguably the most important reason there was a peaceful transition of power in the first place, with the ANC coming to an understanding with not only the Boer elites, but the forces of international Anglo-Saxon financial capitalism they were bound up with.
Despite this, the ANC has continued to assume the appearance of a nominally socialist party and South Africa as a nominally social state, with its Reconstruction and Development Program initiated in the 1990s. But an unprecedented type of proletarianization has occurred in South Africa since then, ironically as a result of the end of political apartheid. The people of South Africa are by and large affected by a type of terminal landlessness, being unable to acquire any real, living existence, forced to live in overcrowded slums and with decaying public infrastructure, effectively foreigners and even trespassers in their own homes. Like the majority of countries today, South Africa maintains the veneer of being a country for, by, and of its people. That means that the government, when all is said and done, exists for the South African people themselves, the improvement of whose welfare is the very reason for its own existence. This is what makes events like the Marikana massacre, where 34 striking black miners were killed by the South African police force, so existentially shocking for the people of South Africa. On the 10th of August 2012, miners initiated a strike, and eventually thousands of other miners began to join in. On the 16th of August, police converged onto the scene of protest, massacring 34 miners in cold blood. What happened at Marikana provoked a powerful question. Who is the South African state really for? The miners, already barely getting by with their poor wages, themselves being the lucky ones in communities rampant with unemployment and inhumane living conditions, came to epitomize a universal existential reality of South Africa's black majority. In killing the miners, the South African state effectively killed its own substantive base, which is the people. It symbolized the most fundamental contradiction outlined before that separates a people from their own living being, and in this case, their own state, which is the most important premise of a stable and secure livelihood in today's capitalism.
Today, you hear a lot about people like Bernie Sanders, AOC, or Jeremy Corbyn, but American leftists seldom talk about what is arguably today's most successful and vigorous revolutionary socialist and even self-identified Marxist-Leninist organization in the contemporary era, the South African Economic Freedom Fighters, or EFF. The EFF was formed in direct response to the events at Marikana. It engraved the contradiction that was exposed at Marikana between the state and the people into the foundation of its own being, discovering in this contradiction the very raw material out of which a truly contemporary socialism in the information age may be born anew. Its central program of land expropriation without compensation, in accordance with the ANC's own original Freedom Charter, has a concrete simplicity that's even more powerful than Bernie Sanders' free healthcare. They aren't just promising free services, they're effectively fighting for people to have the breathing room to participate in producing the very wealth of the state in the first place. But the organization itself has become a dynamic interface between the people's consciousness and concrete political aims such as this. The form of the organization is almost as much an accomplishment of socialism as the realization of the very demand it's structured around. It's what Frederick Jameson's Universal Army looks like in the real-world context, representing the most dynamic relationship between individuals and collective forms of political association to date. It's more than just a party. It's a symbol that's able to cohere meaning across political, cultural, and especially digital space. The EFF wouldn't just accomplish land reform, but also be the interface by which the reform and the cultural revolution corresponding to it would be given meaning and purpose. The way it's able to organize people and dynamically produce forms of collective identification is everything the ANC today fails to do, which is unite people with politics. And the most elementary form of that unity is an army. But this is an army that engages in a plane of warfare arguably more fundamental than armed conflict, the war of political meaning and information.
If leftists in America are really committed to the revival of socialism in their country, they need to put down Jacobin magazine, stop listening to fake Marxist nerds and podcasts, and start trying to learn from the experience of organizations like South Africa's EFF. Although directly emulating such an organization would be ridiculous, the EFF's ability to relate to the predicament of its people, which in their case is South Africa's black majority, represents all the qualities that are missing in people like Bernie Sanders and AOC. Politicians like them only promise to extend America's failed institutions over the whole country as a remedy for every particular ill, rather than minimally relate to the objective contradiction that defines the relationship between the American people and their living being. And instead of producing truly independent forms of media and political culture like the EFF, American progressives effectively do the work of mainstream media and the establishment for free, whether independently or otherwise. And it's not like there's no precedent for something like this in America either. American progressives always draw from events like the New Deal, but a cursory glance into the history that culminated into it will reveal that land reform is the real basis. Instead of trying to save, or worse, extend, America's dying institutions, American socialists can instead learn from phenomena like the Farmers Alliance or the Populist Party, national traditions that are the very raw material out of which a new and authentic American socialism can emerge. Studying from the populists would teach American socialists that the contradiction between the American people and the elites is an objective one, with long traditions giving form to and making sense of this contradiction dating to the very founding of the country. But instead of making sense of the fundamental separation between the American people and the state, institutions and media which claims to represent them, so-called progressives choose to deny the separation altogether. That's because the American left has been dominated by an urban professional managerial class interested only in furthering its social engineering aims, rather than leaders who know how to connect to the longings of the country's real majority.
Above all, it's learning how to concretely articulate this separation that's of decisive significance for American socialists, because it's the very basis of socialism's necessity in the first place. Today, we stand on the precipice of the next great era of world history, the African era, and the great scar that lines the heartland of the African continent will prove to be the adobe out of which the new global proletariat will rediscover its original mission, and which will mark a new chapter in the history of socialist civilization. And the EFF bears the memory of a separation even older than the one revealed in Marikana. It's the memory of the devastation that befell their ancestors from the hour that European colonialism arrived on the African continent. Organizations like the EFF are destined to avenge this most primordial and original of injustices, not by rolling back the wheels of time, but by unleashing the full wealth and power of industrial civilization under the full leadership of the Black African majority. By the memory of its forefathers and the whole people of Africa, in whom no longer lies dormant, calling whose mighty roar will shake the foundations of the earth, the economic freedom fighters, the true sons of the soil, raise their banner from out the scar of the land, and the wound is healed by the spear which smote it.